Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's September 1st, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Morning, Eric. Happy Labor Day. I can't believe it. I always think that once you get to Labor Day, like the fall's just going to go blowing by. So I can't believe we're here.
Not in Texas, though. It doesn't really feel like fall until Christmas, November. Yeah, it gets us a little later. First cold front's around the middle of September, typically.
Is that right? Is that right? My friends in Virginia and New York are telling me it's been gorgeous. 50s, 60s, just kind of like the halcyon days of fall. I love those when the sky's that Polaroid blue. Oof.
Yep. College football this weekend. Happy Valley, the Horseshoe, every place was 70 and sunny. It looked beautiful.
Yeah, I'm kind of perturbed with you now that you made me a Longhorn fan. I've decided I'm here in Austin. I'm overlooking Longhorn Stadium, and then they lose, and my Fever lose. So I'm a little disappointed, but still I believe.
I'd much rather lose to Ohio State in August than in January. And so I think it was a good wake-up call for a lot of the Texas guys, and Arch get some of those struggles out of the way early. Long season ahead.
Yep. And then my Fever lose, although I'm still hopeful Caitlin Clark's going to come back for the playoffs, but I'm not sure I want to. You know, if they're going to be an 8 seed and play the number 1 seed, maybe the right thing for her to do is just get healthy. I don't know. And then I just got to comment on Labor Day because I love holidays like Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, Thanksgiving, the ones that are just disproportionately about getting together. This Labor Day, I'm not able to be at our lake house. My son and his friends and family are, and I'm living the Labor Day dream, which is things are broken at the house. You know, if you're a homeowner, this is where you labor. On the other hand, everyone's having a great time.
I see what you did there. Labor.
Yeah.
Labor as a homeowner. Nice.
Yeah.
Speaking of labor and working hard, did you see Marco Rubio's comment in the cabinet meeting last week about having 4 jobs? And he's especially appreciative of Labor Day weekend, having those 4 jobs: National Security Advisor, Interim Acting Archivist, Secretary of State. And what was the other one? Oh, yeah, USAID.
USAID. Well, he's working hard to get rid of that one. Yeah, super funny. I don't know. For our listening audience, I'm just going to let it pass by with a chuckle. Kind of same thing with Dan Bongino, who continues to complain about how hard his job is as a federal employee. Yes, being responsible is super hard.
Last thing I wanted to comment in this episode, we'll get back to our original formatting. So a few of these articles we're going to talk about, we're going to hit a little briefer, then we'll move into a longer segment, trying to continue to spread some knowledge and not get as in-depth, hit some wave tops, get some analysis from you, Sue, and then try to jump into one longer segment to try to give back some time to our listening audience.
And in deference to our listening audience, Sue is going to try and speak more slowly, although it's super hard because I get excited about topics and about talking to you. But yeah, we're gonna try and be tight and focused. Let's give it a run, Eric.
Let's do it. Let's get to some headlines. So this week in the threat picture, municipalities are national terrain, ransomware and outages in multiple states as MSISAC funding gets cut. Biometrics without a federal rulebook. 23 states and counting, new protections but uneven seams across the national landscape. Gray zone pressure in the Arctic. Danish intelligence sounds the alarm over alleged U.S.-linked influence plays in Greenland. And finally, gathering storm in U.S. agriculture. Vanishing farms, negative incomes, and rising foreign ownership. Food security and rural communities hinge on urgent trade, immigration, and farm bill action. Just in the past few weeks, Nevada, Maryland, and Minnesota have been hit by cyber incidents, including phones down, some specialized transit scheduling has stalled, and in Minnesota, the knucklehead himself, Governor Tim Walz, called in the National Guard Cybersecurity Unit to help with some of these attacks. Interesting use of the National Guard in comparison to what's happening in D.C. This was after Washington announced an $8.3 million cut, roughly half of the remaining annual funding, to the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the MSISAC, which is the coordination hub that supports 18,000 plus state, local, tribal, and territorial governments already running with tiny cyber teams. We talked in episode 2 about the SLCGP, the state and local cybersecurity grant program, which is expected to not be renewed, and whether the federal government is shifting too much risk to municipalities and local. We also discussed how the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center at the ODNI helped link otherwise seemingly disparate cyber attacks together. It's unlikely that these hacks mentioned above were caused by either cut, but the most recent does reduce coordination capabilities. CISA's stance is that the states own their systems, and CISA will keep supporting and coordinating. But my question to you is, who owns the risk? States versus Washington, specifically when that next coordinated campaign hits.
Great question. And I love the point that, just because things are correlated doesn't mean they're causal. I don't think those changes have caused the problem. I just remind this is modern living, right? Whether it's an adversarial or a criminal activity, or quite frankly, just an error and an outage like the CrowdStrike and the airlines, this is part of day-to-day life, and it is massively disruptive. It interrupts services, and sometimes they're just convenient services, and sometimes they're hospitals, or they affect transportation hubs. Just because we're getting used to hearing about it doesn't mean that it's something that we can just accommodate. Ransomware particularly, I find troubling, especially when you get to small entities that aren't big, whether big corporations or large institutions. You just don't have the staff. Every day that you're not working is revenue you're not generating. Information security and cybersecurity is an overhead expense anyway when everyone's getting squeezed. And so I think one of the things that worries me is you're going to start seeing people just pay the ransom so they can get back online because they just don't have the resources. Even though CISA is there ready to coordinate, there just aren't the assets for most entities to be able to do anything other than just leap into the fray. And the problem with that is, and you've heard me talk about this before, Eric, in a digitally connected world, everyone is either target or transportation. You are either the point of an attack or you are the pathway by which people can get someplace else. So even if you pay a ransom, you have no guarantee that your system is cleaned up or that it won't still be there in the future. Now let's get on to state and local. I don't think there's any way around. Individual entities and localities have got to take responsibility for this. There's just no way for a state to say, yeah, you all are all on your own. It just doesn't make any sense, especially as we, clearly as a nation, are moving more toward state-centric activities. The problem is, where's the money going to come from? And who's going to set the standard? And going back to week 2, as you said, I think one of my favorite points from those conversations about localities is even if each state or each community or each association each had their own approach, the inability to, my word for it, what does massing at the border look like? To not gain any insight from similar attacks, to be able to distinguish whether is it just a single event upset or is it actually the beginning of something coordinated. What I'd love to see, although I think this is going to be super problematic just in terms of how politicized the election seems to be becoming, is tie some of these initiatives to election security, not in the sense of locking it down from who's there, but just the security of the infrastructure and the sharing of information across it. We made some headway on that, both in the first Trump administration and during this last administration. I'd like to see us keep going on that. Sometimes you need an organizing principle, and I think elections could be that for state and localities. Big topic. Money's got to come from somewhere, but more than that, intellectual leadership and sharing of data is going to be necessary, regardless of who's got the purse.
All interconnected. And the targeted transportation piece you mentioned, whether that's early warning or if that's just a coordinated counter, I think that's all really important.
Yeah, this massing at the border thing has really, in digital spaces, concerned me for a long time. I just don't know that we have enough of a common view of the digital environment to see, yeah, that's just a million activities because everyone is pursuing digital attack of one way or another, or it actually looks like something more strategic than we ought to be concerned. As we figure out what the distribution of state and local versus federal, I really see need to have a clear picture of the whole of activities so that we can look for those strategic things. Because even though they haven't happened yet and they're hard to affect by adversaries and competitors, boy, we see the precursor activity that could lead to that. And just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it couldn't happen.
Moving on to facial recognition laws. With Congress struggling to do anything, frankly, and no federal regulation on facial recognition, 23 states have passed or expanded laws limiting mass scraping of biometric data per the National Conference of State Legislatures. Colorado last month required consent before using facial voice recognition and banned sale of biometric data. Texas, in June, passed an AI law that outlaws collection of biometric data without permission. And in Oregon of last year, they passed a law requiring consumer opt-in before collecting face, eyes, and voice data. Biometric tech is now ubiquitous across apps and devices, and it's convenient. It's helping us unlock our phones, get through airport security faster, and even access our finances. But there is, quote, no downstream control over how data is captured. Enforcement is real. Google and Meta each agreed to a $1.4 billion settlement with Texas over alleged facial recognition data mining without consent. Clearview AI settled for $51 million for scraping billions of images. And Google also paid $9 million in Illinois over student voice and face data collected without written consent. There's always a trade-off between security and convenience, but Sue, I wonder if the state-by-state biometric restriction makes sense. In many use cases, this is literally the definition of interstate commerce. So should this be federally governed?
Love this topic, huge issue. And this is just the latest instantiation of it. We do not have good policies for data collection use and governance. We just don't. It really came to light with all the data that the social media companies were collecting or the big leaks that came from companies from Marriott to Equifax to OPM that were collecting data and weren't protecting it properly. So this notion of all the data that are being collected, and data are being collected all the time by anybody, and data are the new bacon. And so the demand for use of that is outstripping our ability to govern it according to old laws and standards. So I'm glad we're seeing pushback on the unauthorized collection and consequential potential misuse. I want to talk about the bigger issue associated with it. So number one for me is I'm a national security gal. If you ask me whether I would choose national security or privacy, if those two things couldn't be resolved, I'd choose privacy every day of the week and twice on Sundays. I just think it is so central to who we are as a nation. Protecting personally identifiable information, how you can share it, how you can use it, how you can sell it. The problem we have is there are laws on how the government can collect and use it, but citizens are willingly giving all their stuff away to anybody who asks for it in order to be able to buy a pair of shoes. And so we really have to settle in and decide what the fundamental principle is, who can collect it, how it can be shared, what the policies are, what agreements you have to have in order to be able to do it. I will say, Eric, that there's no panacea here. Because if you go to the security side, all those rules I just described about how each data set should be governed are the reasons that we can't share data in moments that we need to be able to share data. Everyone just designed their own standard and their own policy and their own legal constraint around their data sets. So we're just going to have to, I think, go back to almost founders' visions. What are the fundamental things we need to be able to do? What are the things we believe in terms of privacy? And then rebuild some more modern standards up against it. I'm not sure that we have the time, the interest, or even the structures right now to be able to come up with statute to be able to govern this. So I would say that every state should prescribe a policy, right? Even if you don't have federal statute to tell you what to do, come up with your own data standard, data ethic. So at least when something happens, then you can go back and say, we did have a structure in place. And even if it turned out not to be sufficient, then you can go from there. I would say the same thing for any company or entity that trades, all those people that have just been sued. Have your own policy, have something that prescribes use, understand the limits of it, so at least when something happens, you can go from there. But this is one of those challenges that is such a complexity volumetric ownership problem that we almost don't have the governmental structures right now to be able to deal with it, even though we are feeling the aggregate effect. Maybe you and I put it onto our platform of when we build a new digital infrastructure, like Eisenhower's hideaway system, maybe we make the policies and the laws part of that structure.
Yeah, I guess my concern is just over each state. What you could do is you could lock it down if the company isn't meeting the requirements per state, right? So, for example, I can't online gamble in Texas. FanDuel won't work because it knows my location. But as soon as I relocate to Louisiana and I'm geolocated there, now it'll allow me to use the app. So, I guess you could shut these down. It just seems like, yes, at least we're making some progress and doing something, but you're just creating all this confusion if you don't have a baseline from the federal level. What do you think?
Totally agree. It just feels like time is passing without that ability to establish, in a weird sort of way, we're still underusing technology as controls, right? Geolocation, tying things to a place, a time, and a person, having permissions associated with each of those that are dependent on who I am, I think are some solutions that can get us there. But even so, the mechanisms to agree to that standard, and I haven't even talked about everything that's going on globally in terms of each nation's data standards. So, big problem, but to be kind of with you on this, we can't take the fact that we don't have perfection in order to do some of the things. And so, like I said, I go back to having states prescribe what their standards are.
Yep, but not on AI. That's got to be federal. All right, keep moving. Greenland influence gets frosty. Denmark summoned the top U.S. diplomat after reports that Americans with political ties tried to push secession in Greenland. Copenhagen called any interference, quote, unacceptable. Danish intelligence warns influence campaigns were aimed at sowing discord between Denmark and Greenland via recruited local actors and disinformation. Washington reaffirmed strong ties with Greenlandic self-determination and told the Danes to, quote, calm down. So my query of Google's Gemini AI said that the phrase calm down is generally unhelpful in arguments and often escalates conflict. Did the U.S. get our hand caught in the cookie jar here, Sue? Or the Konbitschnagel or drug McCain container, as it were?
You're a multidimensional guy. We're going to make up some time on this one. One, Arctic is important, very gray zoney in terms of figuring things out. Two, the Danes are a very, very capable intelligence service. If they said it out loud, they know it. And I think the response is ridiculously arrogant and completely misunderstanding of how the world order is going from there. But yes, fascinating. No, I'm not a fan of it.
Yeah, I think across all these, we had a few different themes, local being national. These city networks are strategic terrain, and we've got to really take a look at the first mile of cyber. Biometric governance matters. We need clarity and accountability, and getting the states being the first mover is really helpful here. And then finally, the Arctic gray zone, pursuing minerals and mission without burning trust in allies. So we do have our own strategic interests. We've talked about that before,
Totally.
but we also have friends, and relationships are important.
Yeah, and I'll just say again on the cyber things, even if it's just disruption, even if it's not malfeasant, open societies require default to trust. If you start not being able to trust your systems, whether I can walk down the street without being identified, or I'm going to be able to pursue a service without it being shut down because of ransom, this is really problematic. We can't pretend that this stuff is going to get better by ignoring it or letting it just evolve naturally. These are big national issues.
Now we're moving on to the Heartland and agriculture. Beth Ford, the CEO and president of Land O'Lakes, warns of a, quote, gathering storm in U.S. agriculture as farm numbers shrink. About 24,000 dairy farmers and 400,000 grain growers today are projected to soon fall roughly 10% to 21,000 dairy farmers and only 300,000 grain growers. Only 28% of the farms that existed 90 years ago remain. Compounding pressures, including high interest rates, falling commodity prices and crops, Rising input and automation costs, labor shortages, shifting trade dynamics, and extreme weather are all driving successive drops in net farm income, doubled bankruptcies year over year, and heavy reliance on off farming earnings to self subsidize. Ms. Ford urges action on a robust trade agenda, immigration reform, and passage of a new farm bill framing food security as national security. And so, through this topic, we'll talk about food security as national security, who owns our farms in this country, the consolidation of the farm industry and technological inputs, communities, and a policy call to action. So, at a basic level, food is one of our physiological needs like breathing, water, shelter, clothing, and sleep. Sue, what are your thoughts on this concern from the Land O'Lakes CEO?
Yeah, I think you and I both saw this article and instantaneously recognized this as a national security issue. I thought the interview was fantastic. I thought her perspective was both data rich and well reasoned and not hyperbolic. I think this is the right topic for us. We'll get to the national security piece. I will just say that I think sometimes we forget our nation's history and our success globally is disproportionately dependent on the geography that we are graced to occupy. Talk about an abundance of riches, whether that is oceans that protect us or climate that is temperate or land that will grow things. I think we forget how important our land is to who we are. So just squandering that, not protecting it, not understanding that in any of the dimensions, I think is folly on our part. Her point that food security is national security, I couldn't agree more. We talk a lot about supply chain issues, and most often when it comes to rare earth minerals or chips, I talk a lot about talent, but the ability to produce and sustain the food that our people needs is absolutely huge. And we're going to talk about how we do that. I know that you and I both feel super strongly about the importance of individuals and communities and actually having people that care, not just the provision of services. And so these numbers I thought were shocking in what's happened over time. And then if you overlay that fact with what we're doing in terms of our economic policies and what we're forcing and what we're expecting, the idea that we have policies that are counterproductive to one another, whether that is the labor we need in our immigration policies or the consumers we have and cutting foreign aid and leaving things out. I just think not thinking holistically about how foundational our ability to actually produce what we need and what will sustain us and then is a source of economic strength is important to focus on. I think she put it forward really clearly. I love this issue. I think it is central to who we are. I think it's central to our national strength. We know this globally. If people don't have food, there will be problems. And so that seems hyperbolic for just talking about farms and the relative wealth that we have, but I think it's a central issue.
Yeah, for sure. So there's been a number of articles over the years about foreign held land and Chinese coming in to buy a lot of our farmland. Foreign investors held about 45 to 46 million acres of U.S. agricultural land as of the end of 2023. So that's about 3.5% of the privately held agricultural land. Canada actually is by far the largest holder because most of that is forestry land. China's footprint is actually pretty tiny, but politically salient and concentrated in certain contexts. So they're doing things like wind leases, proximity cases, and some of the articles folks may have seen have been in terms of how close they were to strategic military bases, specifically nuclear sites and nuclear launch sites in the Midwest. But those have declined to about 277,000 acres in 2023, or only about 0.02% of privately held ag land for the Chinese. So acres matter, but where the acres are and what rights are attached matters more. Multiple states now restrict the purchases from foreign adversary countries, including Texas's Senate Bill 17, introduced in 2025. This is one of the most high-profile recent examples. And then finally, in July, The Agricultural Secretary, Brooke Rollins, was joined on stage by Defense Secretary Hegseth and Homeland Security Secretary Noem and said that the administration is going to work with state lawmakers to ban sales of U.S. farmland to buyers from China and other countries of concern, citing those national security interests. They're also looking at ways to recoup some of the already completed purchases, but I imagine that that's going to be pretty difficult to do. Smithfield Foods, which folks may have heard about, they're a leader in packaged meat, including bacon, deli meat, and also Nathan's hot dogs. If you didn't know, they are actually Chinese owned. They were purchased by the Shuangwei International Holdings Limited in 2013. They since rebranded to WH Group because I guess Shuangwei was a little troubling for some folks. So, what do you think about this foreign investment in our agricultural industry and some of the high profile ones that China has in terms of both Smithfield being a large producer of pork and then also where the acres are and what rights are attached?
I'll go back to something I've talked about in previous episodes, and that is kind of the strengths and weaknesses of democratic societies and authoritarian societies. So, love competition and investment and energy of democratic capitalistic societies. It is a real area of strength. On the other hand, in times of change, it tends not to be well coordinated. If you look at China as another example, they have 5-year plans and they have industries that they're going after. And they have the Belt and Road and the Silk Road initiatives where they can focus on a national strategy. And those two things bouncing in against each other often leaves us at a disadvantage because we're not centralized against a centralized objective. I think we can see in lots of domains that has been, whether it is their pursuit of various companies to invest and then take over in offshore technologies, or the ability they've had to insinuate themselves into our universities and shape research. And then this land is another example. So I think you see those two things hitting against each other. Now, I tend not to be isolationist because I see the other things that come with being a nation where people can invest and we attract talent. And when we don't have money, we can use money to achieve our objectives. You just described the challenges that farming is under. I'm not sure I want to just be completely blanket and say I'll never take money. So I think where I come down is, and this is hard because, again, we're so distributed. This is great advice I'm going to give. Don't be dumb. There are reasons that investment in America is good. Being mindful about whether you're turning over controlling interests is something that every single entity should do. So that's just kind of general local level. What do I do if someone comes to me with a pile of money and says, I'll gladly give you this money if I'm the one who can make all the decisions? You probably ought to walk away from that. I think one of the reasons that you're hearing more about the land issue is we have had for the longest time in national security the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. that reviews foreign purchase and investment in U.S. companies for exactly the purpose of not giving away one of our strongest assets. There's also the Foreign Investment Risk and Review Act, which introduced more focus on real estate and land investment. And actually, the Trump administration, and even in this second version, has strengthened those. And so you're seeing that as more an area of focus. I love that they're going to work with state and local to share the wisdom that they have at the national level, because state and local aren't going to be sitting with justice and DOD in order to be able to see the implication of all that. So this is a great use of federal insight being shared with the people that are affecting it. I'm glad to see it. But again, I don't think it's a simplistic A is good, B is bad. I think this is much more about how you balance investment versus control, and how do you share insight about intent of the purchasers. It is a fun excursion we should do sometime about where the Chinese are purchasing land. It's a pretty interesting story. But on the state and local, I think being mindful of it, and I think this is an area where U.S. policy is trying to provide some help to localities who are under that pressure. I worry a little bit, kinda like the TikTok story, that one thing that was banned yesterday is gonna be allowed tomorrow, and so I worry a little bit that this administration is more situational than I'd like them to be, but I still think the trend is in the right direction to consider real estate as an asset, not just company interest.
Yeah, and in the case of Smithfield Foods in 2013, they were struggling, and this Chinese investment has led a considerable turnaround in the company, jobs here in America. It also kind of parallels two of the stories we talked about previously. This is great that the states are taking the initiative, setting laws up against these, similar to the facial recognition, and working with the federal government on coordination. So while cyber is cutting some of their coordination element, it looks like there's a whole of government approach to help communicate some of this across Secretary of Defense, Homeland Security, and Agriculture to help identify this. Because you think state and local, some of these communities might see, hey, this is a great investment. We're
Right.
getting all this money. Maybe it's underutilized land, but without seeing the bigger picture and the coordination that the federal government provides, you miss some risk factors.
It's a very similar issue internationally between our allies and partners, the money they take, the difference between real investment and insinuating yourself into a nation's control. But a good micro issue for us, I like the trend though of sharing insight.
Yep. And in terms of bringing in Chinese investment, you've talked before about at universities and also in the academic and research and tech sectors, having some of that foreign influence is really helpful.
It's how we are who we are. The idea of shutting down foreign students just seems antithetical to everything else we're trying to achieve in terms of growth and leadership in technology. So just a balance. We'll keep working on it.
Yeah, and then last point on this topic, Chinese buy a significant number of the soybean crop, which is a large production crop in the United States. Since the 1990s, ceded that top spot to Brazil. Brazil is now the dominant supplier. China gets about 70% of their soybean imports from Brazil, while the U.S. has slipped to about 22%. But we still provide a significant amount of soybeans on a seasonal basis. Just something to keep an eye on in terms of how tied we are to China with them needing our soybeans.
The maddening thing on some of this is we are a preferred supplier. The quality of our labor force, the quality of our technology, the amount of resources that when we decide that we're going to invest in what we can produce, people want to buy from us. It's the consonance of all our policies that I think really need to be looked at to make sure that we are making the best decisions about how we are the strongest. And that strength is not just national power or reputation, but actually the foundation that lets us have that. That is the farms, the technology, the education that we have to buttress those things. So don't forget how in demand we are and the assets that we have. But if we're discordant, I think we are now in an equivalent enough environment that we can lose some of those advantages just over expedience or economics.
So if the Chinese aren't buying all the land, who is? The largest private owners are Bill Gates and his Cascade firm. There's other tech-backed projects like the California Forever Project, and also some real estate investment trusts, Farmland Partners, Gladstone, etc., and private equity. Historically, you get a cash yield of about 2 to 5% from these typical row crops. But then there's land appreciation, which is somewhat cyclical. And some of this is difficult for private equity to achieve their 8 to 12% returns that you're looking for on these investments. They're seeking operational upgrades. So they're trying to do different things with water and energy development, occasionally using higher and better use sales. So they're taking the land and instead of planting crops, putting renewables or developing part of the land to boost returns. But from a community lens, the capital can professionalize the practices, but can also hollow out some of the local roots if those aren't protected or if governance is absent. So, Sue, do you think that outside owners bring resilience in terms of their investment, their modernization, et cetera, to these communities, or does it erode these communities?
So I'm going to say a couple things and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric, because you're of Texas and you have, some family perspective on this. Number one, I think communities are really important. The cornerstone of communities are owners who have an investment in the land and more than this, the production of wealth but actually the persistence of society. And so in general, I worry when we lose that coupling of our businesses to our communities. In a weird sort of way, with our previous conversation on China, when you have a company come in, they sometimes have different interests, what they're trying to maximize, the rules they set, the decisions they make about everything from what crops they plant to what pesticides they use to the prices they set that are all part of a larger economic gain than the maintenance of that resource against the objectives of the farmers. As we said with China, you can't be simplistic about this because Beth Ford's articulation of the challenges of resources is tough, but being mindful about how you accept that money, companies in terms of PE or big companies who buy it, asking questions about what their return on investment is going to be, what their commitment is going to be to the community. I see it in terms of economic reality. I think it is really problematic in terms of the continued erosion of a personal tie from the people to the land, to the responsibility, to then ultimately what is the foundation of our national security, which is the American people. I worry after this because I don't think the interests are the same. And if it's ungoverned or unattended to, we could end up eroding that which I think is the thing that we most need to strengthen. If you ask me, looking at America right now that is certainly disrupted, and I think I've said this before, you're not going to affect change by starting at the presidency. You're going to affect change starting at communities. And so these farms are often the anchor tenants of communities. So I think it's super important, and I think we have to address this as an issue of national strength. But you live it, Eric.
Yeah, I've seen growing up how important a predominant business in a community can be to the community as a whole, not just driving revenue in terms of taxation and being the primary funder of the school taxes, but also just how a local business can influence the community and help, from sponsoring the local baseball team to supporting other businesses and helping a community thrive and survive. And so I think it's really important to invest in these local areas and keep part of that local identity. But I also, going out on a limb here, I'm going to defend private equity. Not all private equity is bad. Some that come in and want to do scorched earth and we're just going to cut because operations is the fastest way to save money and improve your bottom line. But I've met many private equity companies who've invested in state and local communities, invested in local businesses, and really turned it into a partnership where they work alongside those business owners that were either looking for a transition, they were looking for an exit strategy, or they just didn't have the capacity to grow and scale because they were so focused on the day-to-day. I think it just kind of depends on who's coming in. My concern, though, it's hard to make those 8 to 12% returns here on an industry that's barely getting by, and the median is losing $328 a year off their balance sheet. So maybe you do that by volume. Maybe you do that buying so much land and you're harvesting so many crops that you're able to offset some of those concerns. But cost cutting is always the fastest way to get there. If you're not going to get this return by farming, what else can we do with this land?
Yeah, love that point. An overall theme of these now 8 episodes that we've produced is yes and. I, too, have been graced to work with private equity companies who are actually interested in more than the flip. I'm wondering if some of the solution isn't adjacencies, not just thinking about just the land or just a single business, but all the things that make for supply chain security. And so you're investing in more of an ecosystem of capability rather than a single one. And does that provide some of the diversification that gives you differential return? I think you and I are both big community builders and think that's where we have the most commonality, most strength.
Regardless, consolidation is happening, right? We talked about the decreasing numbers. There's less than 2 million farms in the United States. And the number that stuck out before was only 28% of the farms that existed 90 years ago are operating today. As the number of farms declines, one segment that was growing was the number of farms that are over 5,000 acres in class. So small to mid-sized farms are declining. One of the things that this adjacent article pointed out was technology, GPS, autonomy, analytics. Those enable scale, but automation is more expensive. We've mentioned that the negative $328 per year median income of these farms and innovation in technology should help overcome some of those challenges, but there's significant investment and capital expenditure upfront to get there. One of the ideas that's been floated, this investment tax credit, it failed to make it into the last farm bill, but momentum is growing at the federal level to create incentives for this climate smart agriculture and innovation. Proponents argue that these decades of subsidies have locked the food system into a very narrow focus. So, about 95% of subsidies go to the major commodity crops such as soybeans, wheat, corn, sugarcane, and rice. Critics cite this green revolution that's been feeding the world's population, but it's fragile and unstable, and, in my opinion, not diversified enough. Digital tools could help farmers adapt, but again, only 5% of farmers globally are using them. Barriers such as limited access to knowledge and money are some of the problem. So this median loss of 328 needs a jump. So what are your thoughts on the investment tax credit idea and shifting the priorities from some of these subsidies to more innovation centric?
Well, I think technology can certainly help. I love investment tax credit. We could have a conversation about who's doing the investment. If this really is national security, is there investment that is more government focused on some of these technologies? I can squint at everything that's available, from all the sensing we can do from space that can support the Earth, all the things that companies are doing in order to be able to take that data and instantaneously turn it into what each piece of farm equipment is doing to do it effectively. We can image it. We can find out about damage well before damage manifests. I think all those are available to us. What I worry about is, what's our vision? What's our objective? What are we trying to do? Whether at the state or local level or at the national level, no aggregation of capabilities is enough to make something happen, right? So we can make everything better. We can do things faster. We can do it more efficiently. We can know more. But I don't know that we have a vision for ag in America. Who are we? What are we intending to do? How are we going to best affect that? I love individual owners who feel the land. I also think there's room for the U.S. to decide who we're going to be. There are tons of things we can do on the capability side. I always am excited about what technology will allow us to do and know how fast it will over what areas. But I don't think that's our challenge. I think our challenge is vision. I don't think we have a clear fix of who we are, where we're trying to go, or what we need to be.
That's a good point. If you create all this excess capacity and volume, what are you going to do with that food? I mean, you could sell it, but is there necessarily a market? I guess through innovation, you're looking more at cost cutting and operational efficiency. So that would help increase that bottom line to a positive number for these farms and the national resilience of having more farms. But to your point, like we've talked about with the OD&I, if you don't know where you're going, it's hard to
It's hard to get there. One of the things I love about technology, and I love about sensing the earth, and I think we still haven't used this as effectively as we might, we can move to the left of crisis, right? When you can see enough with enough sensors over enough time and enough area, you can see changes early that allow you to prepare. Again, I think there's tons of potential, but I'm not sure that we have an organized view of where we must go.
To a point, though. I don't know that weatherman's ever going to get his prediction right. Even no matter how much AI you have, I don't know if the weather guesser's ever going to be right.
Oh, I was thinking about little soybeans under stress and our ability to sense them in different
Oh, that's
wavelengths.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the weather guesser is always going to keep his job.
Especially if we keep disabling satellites that are working. And again, I just remind, we make choices as a nation of who we send to Washington to set these policies. We put pressure by what we say is important to us. I think y'all looking at this issue, you will come away, as Eric and I do, that this is an easy one to miss because it happens in our heartland, not on the coasts. But it's hard to imagine that it's something that is more foundational to our strength.
So what we're watching, Sue, what you got going on into the next week?
I think my big one is it kind of passed a little unnoticed. And this is the whistleblower at Social Security over the aggregation of Doge data and putting it all in what purports to be a not necessarily secure database. That is completely related to the things we talk about. That is a lot of personal data. Back to national security and privacy. One of the reasons we have the laws we do is because you don't want to escalate government privilege. So to put all that data, make it available, maybe not secure it so that someone could steal it, but also make it available so it could be used by people who don't necessarily have the same understanding that I do about limitations, I think is super worrisome, and it's something that I'm certainly watching. To your point about capabilities and all the new technologies, boy, we're in a world now where the technologies are available to be able to make use of massive amounts of data, but not necessarily to draw all the right conclusions with it without governance. So this is kind of a firestorm with our most sensitive data in a way that seems largely uncontrolled. So that's my number one right now.
Move fast and break shit is good for the tech companies and good in some instances to get some fresh blood in there. But at the same time, there's a reason the
Yeah.
government moves slowly.
Repeatable, transparent, and fair.
Yep. For me, watching this SCO summit coming out of China, Putin meets with Xi. There's a parade on the 3rd in Beijing. So watching a little bit of China, Russia, their
Yep.
energy and defense signals, and then also India and China, Moody and Xi just met over the weekend. So kind of seeing their partnership come back together.
Boy, yeah, the Modi piece seems like a really problematic development. It feels like a minute ago we were, as a nation, we're looking at the tremendous potential of India as a partner, and it feels like that we've pushed them in a different direction. So I agree with you. This is a good one to watch.
50% tariffs on their oil.
Yep.
Not friendly. And then the other one is we got jobs data coming out on the 5th, non-farm payrolls. So we'll set the macro backdrop. Maybe get another indication on how tariffs are impacting us. They're unconstitutional tariffs.
A lot of stuff in play. Are we going to believe the data? Are we going to be told that the data aren't true? Maybe there's more work for us to do in the future. Maybe we'll get to an episode 9 or 10, Eric.
Ooh, maybe so. That's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government. It's in its people.
So thanks for joining us this week. Remember, we're here for you. Look for a link in the show notes to provide us feedback or suggest topics for the next time. And please join us next week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you go to listen. And remember, go forth, do good, and be kind to one another.